Hi everyone, welcome to this School of Materialist Research mini podcast series that we're doing. I'm Alfie Bown. I'm going to be teaching a course in the fall semester for School of Materialist Research, and my own course will be about capitalism and psychosis. Hopefully people will find that interesting. But what I'm also doing as part of this summer is recording some short interviews with some of the members of faculty that are teaching at School of Materialist Research this fall. So today we're joined by Rocco Gangle, who's going to be teaching a course in September, October time at SMR. So thanks for joining us, Rocco. How are you doing?
Great. Yeah, thanks for inviting me here. It's good to see you.
Yeah, you too. So we've known each other over the years, of course. Yeah, Rocco is a fantastic philosopher who's, I've seen many talks of his before, but not around the topic of his forthcoming course, which is about the concept of autopoiesis, which he's co-writing a new book about, which should be out in the coming year or so, co-written with Gianluca Caterina, and that's coming out with Springer. And you've another forthcoming book coming out with Edinburgh as well. Rocco, what's the subject of that one?
So that's going to be called Semiotic Immanence, Category Theory for Contemporary Metaphysics, sort of a sequel to Diagrammatic Immanence that came out about 10 years ago.
Which you did with EUP, 2016. So he's published many books and two new forthcoming ones. He's also professor of philosophy at Endicott College, which is that somewhere near Boston?
Yes, yeah, just north of Boston.
Just north of Boston, and his course will be what we're going to do with these podcasts. Very casual thing. They're not going to be full lectures or full interviews. They're going to be little tasters, 20 to 30 minutes, so that people can see what the different courses, modules that are on offer at School of Materialist Research in this fall section is. And if you want to see all those courses, we've got really exciting people, including Alberto Toscano, Alenka Zupancic, Claire Colebrook, Rocco, myself. If you want to see those courses, the website is just going at the bottom there, schoolofmaterialistresearch.org. So that's where you want to go if you want to sort of sign up to one and take these courses. That's assuming you like what we do in the next 20 minutes. So let's jump into it, Rocco. And, I was just going to ask you, first of all, to say, 10 minutes of, or 5 to 10 minutes of what your course is going to be about. But why don't we start with what is autopoiesis? Because this is obviously your big title, and it's something that some people might have heard before, some people might not have at all. So what is autopoiesis, and what's your course going to be dealing with?
Sure, and yeah, it's a great question. It's a neologism. It was introduced by a pair of Chilean biologists in the early 1970s, Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. They were working in the area of what now we call systems biology, thinking about organic life in terms of networks of relations. And they coined this term autopoiesis from the Greek to produce, to make oneself, to make. An autopoietic system is a system that somehow builds or constructs or reconstructs itself. And this concept, even if it was named by Maturana and Varela, I think goes back certainly to philosophical ideas in German idealism. Hegel can be understood as a kind of philosopher of autopoiesis, the autopoietic nature of spirit. And I think going all the way back to Aristotle, in the Western tradition, the notion of the self, the notion of the identity of an object, or particularly a subject, always involves a kind of productive mechanism. And so that's, I think, one of the impetuses for the course is to think of this relatively contemporary concept of autopoiesis as really a concept that retroactively can be thought of as a kind of governing principle for the whole Western tradition. What I have worked on with my two colleagues, Gianluca Caterina and Fernando Tomé, and the basis of the book that hopefully will come out in about a year, is modeling autopoietic systems using the techniques of the branch of mathematics called category theory. Category theory is a very convenient mathematical setting for thinking about systems of relations. And the appropriateness of category theory for modeling autopoiesis, I think, is deeply related to the kind of paradoxical character of autopoiesis. That autopoiesis risks being a kind of empty concept because the very content of the thing that is produced is the form of its production, right? And this is something that is recognized frequently in terms of the notion of subjectivity, right? That subjectivity has a kind of transcendental character. We can't look at the thing itself because the operation is the thing. But when we step back and abstract away from notions of consciousness and notions of subjectivity, we recognize a similar dynamic at work just in isolating the notion of an organism. How do we individuate an organic thing? Well, the organic thing is a structure, right? But it's a structure that is what it is because of the behaviors, the operations that not only depend upon that structure, but tend to maintain and reconstruct that structure. So what the course is trying to do in general is take this notion of autopoiesis and try to think of it from the ontological point of view of what kind of being is a being that exists to the extent that it operates on itself and reproduces itself, and conversely, what might thinking of beings from the standpoint of autopoiesis allow us to do in terms of rehabilitating ontology? Because I think that's one of the things that's especially interesting about category theory is it gives us a mathematical way to think about the priority of relations over things. And if we use that mathematical tool as a kind of guiding thread maybe for thinking about ontology, for thinking about being as such, it might be that this notion of autopoiesis gives us a certain handle on what a process-oriented ontology would look like that doesn't fall into the standard trap of sort of dissolving all things into just pure flux. Because I think what makes autopoiesis particularly interesting is that it integrates fully the notions of structure and process. So those are the two main concepts that we'll be dealing with in the course, the notion of structure as a way to organize material in an autopoietic system, the notion of process as the operation that structure takes both on its environment and on itself in order to both maintain and reconstruct itself. And then our third concept, agency, is using the notion of autopoiesis as a way to maybe reframe the notion of agency.
Yeah, we're just back on. Hopefully that was a small hiccup. And you were just saying, Rocco, that the third concept you're adding into this discussion is agency. Mm-hmm. So if you want to finish that point.
Yeah. So I guess in line somewhat with the materialist orientation of the SMR, I think the notion of agency that I'd like to try to develop on the basis of autopoiesis and thinking of category theory constructions would be a type of agency that would exist somewhere between the two extremes of, let's call them transcendentalism on the one hand, in which subjectivity is understood as some kind of condition of possibility for experience and structure of the world as such, right? So that subjectivity has no kind of internal structure that can be known from the outside. And where the other extreme would be something like eliminativism, where agency and subjectivity are considered to be mere illusions, and we have some kind of purely like mechanical, deterministic picture of systems. I'd like to think of agency as something that is constituted by physical systems, but is irreducible to any fully determined organization constitutive of a system at any particular time, right? And this is, I think, the great challenge of the notion of agency is to think of the kind of real modal character of beings in the world, so that they are of the world, they aren't transcendent to it or conditions of possibility of the world, they are parts of the world, but within the world, they somehow give rise to new phenomena, right, and new possibilities that wouldn't be there otherwise. And one philosopher that I think is very much in line with the way I'd like to think about this is Felix Guattari, his notion of subjectivity. He draws a lot on Peirce, and Peirce is a big influence on me, and that Peircean notion of agency is definitely kind of part of the program.
Okay, no, that's the last point. Would be interesting to hear a little bit more about the Guattari C.S. Peirce thing. But so just on these three terms, then, if I can just clarify a few things: structure, process, agency. These are the three terms which are together in your mind. They together constitute autopoiesis, right? So are these three key aspects of which come together to form an autopoietic structure?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great.
And I think structure and process are constitutive in the sense that I think that it's feasible to organize a comprehensive theory of autopoiesis that is simply a integration of structure and process with sort of the right parameters, a structure that reproduces itself according to a process that itself has a structure, so that there's a structure of the process and a process of the structure. And once you have that kind of mutually enveloping hierarchy, I think that captures the dynamic of autopoiesis. But then within that framework, I think it's possible to rethink the notion of agency.
Yeah,
that's kind of the program.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's really, really interesting, and it goes to what was going to be my question was when I first looked at your course description, and you're talking about how autopoietic systems might include things like an ecosystem or a human society. I was thinking, okay, maybe this is a critique of capitalism or something. You're describing, contemporary capitalist life as autopoietic or something like that. But in what you're describing here, it sounds like what you're more interested in is something approaching a theory of the subject, right? It's the subject which you're understanding as autopoietic as it exists within ecosystems, organisms, or whatever. Or are you also using this term autopoiesis to understand broader human structures and societies?
Yeah, and that's one important thinker in this area for me has been Niklas Luhmann, the German sociologist, who explicitly uses the notion of autopoiesis and draws on the logician George Spencer Brown, who developed this very interesting formal theory of what he calls re-entry of the form, which was one of the tools used by Varela in particular in trying to formalize the notion of autopoiesis. And so on the one hand, you've got this German sociologist who provides a quite robust theory of modern societies that's grounded in the notion of autopoiesis. But I think to respond to your notion of capitalism, Luhmann doesn't seem to have much of a critical purchase on anything. At the end of the day, his theory of society is in a certain sense purely descriptive. There's no way to criticize what happens. Autopoiesis for him is just simply a kind of autopoietic system of communications with its own kind of self-organizing structure. And that's why I think it's important to introduce the notion of agency as something that is enabled by autopoiesis, but not reducible to it, so that I think there is room for a critical orientation within the framework of autopoiesis. And that's where I think someone like Guattari is interesting in thinking of subjectivity. Subjectivity is itself autopoietic, but it also is a kind of effect of autopoietic systems, in particular social systems, in particular various material kind of energetic systems and so forth.
No, and I think that's very good, really good, clear answer. And I think it's very interesting and critical for any materialist school, I guess, thinking about to what extent is our position, collective position or whatever, a descriptive analysis, and to what extent is it something perhaps not prescriptive, but which can allow us to do something other than just describe, which I think is a very interesting topic of discussion anyway. But maybe as a last point, we can talk a bit more about this. You mentioned a couple of times Guattari's theory or concept of agency, and I mean that's something I'd like to know more about. I mean, I became at some point interested in Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the subject, basically as it functions as a critique of Lacanian psychoanalytic concepts of the subject, which is what I tend to use in my work. So I'm interested to hear a bit more about Guattari's concept of agency and why in particular you see something useful in there.
Yeah, well, I see a lot of commonality between Guattari and Julia Kristeva in that both of them were very influenced by Lacan, were trying to take insights in Lacanian psychoanalysis in a more materialist direction, and both of them influenced by Peirce. And I think what they converge on is a notion of subjectivity as an emergent layer grounded in certain rhythmic, energetic material processes, so that there are certain intensities that create fields of resonance through repetition, right? And this could be something like the rhythms of the body. This could be, babbling speech, where you have like a pop, 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 pop sort of sound that, in stammering starts to fold back onto itself to generate a second order structure where things become possible, right? And I think especially Kristeva wants to emphasize how this material sort of rhythmic layer of subjectivity and language always remains present even when it's suppressed, as it normally is in adult, conversation, in ordinary discourse and so forth. But it comes back to light, particularly in poetic discourse, right? And then of course in, the psychoanalytic symptom and these kinds of things. But I think that this is, the interesting model of emergent subjectivity is to see material processes themselves as capable of organizing the introduction of new possibilities at the ontological level through certain kinds of resonant, repetitive phenomena, right? So that ultimately it's rhythm, right, that makes something like subjectivity possible.
Yes.
Right? And this is I think that the transition point, let's say, from materiality to something like subjectivity, right? I want to resist the notion that there's somehow like a leap of ontological levels. Emergence often is treated as if it is something supervenes on the material, but rather it seems as if material processes constitute new possibilities once they organize themselves through certain kinds of relationships between structure and process.
Yeah, I mean, another fascinating aspect, of what you're even briefly just touching on here, and I guess this again is something you mentioned before, that you're actually thinking about computational systems such as cellular automata, you say in your description, and how autopoiesis can be instantiated in various computational environments. And this, what you just said, kind of makes me want to frame this in a slightly different way as well, is, because one temptation here for me would be to say, your theory of autopoiesis is a theory of the subject. It basically describes what is different about humans than machines, and this is why they have an unconscious or a symptom or whatever, whereas the computation environment tends not to have an unconscious, or so we think. But it seems like I'd be getting it wrong if I went down that path, right? Because you're actually saying that in computational systems or other environments, even ones without an unconscious, you might still see this structure emerging. Would that be right?
Yeah, exactly. And part of, I think, what's interesting about trying to develop a theory of autopoiesis is to look at the minimal set of necessary conditions that make some kind of autopoietic process possible. And Maturana and Varela, when they introduced the concept, used the notion of a boundary, and they were thinking especially of a kind of a lipid membrane as the boundary of a cell. And they really thought that, at the very origin of life, there was the separation using a kind of lipid membrane of an inside from an outside, right? So that a dynamic is introduced that we can look at from the outside and think of as a distinction between system and environment, right? Different conditions hold inside the cell membrane. Why? Well, because it's separated, right? Because it's distinguished from its outside. And that's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient, right? It's not enough to just have a boundary. There has to be a boundary that then produces, through its own separating off of its internal characteristics, conditions within the boundary for the reproduction of the boundary and its internal conditions. And what's interesting about systems like cellular automata is you have, in a completely formal environment, right? A cellular automaton is technically just a mathematical object, but you have a kind of simulation of space and time, right? And the kind of minimal modeling of space in a cellular automaton is a distinction between local effects and global systems, right? So that the cellular automaton is spread out, let's say, in a two-dimensional array, but what happens for any particular cell is only determined by what happens in its immediate neighborhood. And so this is, I think, a really interesting kind of theory of space, right? What is space? It's something like locality and local determination. And so within the framework of cellular automata, it's possible to witness the construction of boundaries, right? You can construct a group of cells that are live or operative in some way. And if we tweak traditional cellular automata a little bit, then we can start to think about how the construction of a boundary can then induce a transition within the local rules themselves. And that's I think the kind of twist that seems to speak to your point about subjectivity without humanizing or trying to make conscious these formal environments or these non-human systems. It's recognizing that complete mathematical determination is going to be insufficient, because what needs to happen is the introduction of some kind of aleatoric deviation from the deterministic rules, right? So that locality has to be subject to deformation, right? Within a local environment, the rules become different, and then adaptation to that difference within the boundary seems to give rise to these things that simulate agency, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting, and it's obviously it's a good and important topic. I mean, it would, again, in that sense, it would appeal or should appeal to anyone interested in computation and so-called artificial intelligence or whatever, because there you see this problem where all the discussion always gets bogged down in, okay, can it be like a human or not? Then obviously we can say that certain things it can't replicate, but what can it do is perhaps produce new spaces, new systems which function in quite unique ways, where the sort of opposition between subject and subjectivity and mathematical machine is not actually the most useful way of thinking about it. And you're coming up with a term which suggests, how about we use this term to understand the kinds of spaces and systems that can be produced and reproduced in these technological conditions or whatever. So I think that, this seems like something that would appeal, of course, to philosophers and to those interested in subjectivity and identity, but also potentially just as much to those who want to understand what's happening with contemporary computation and systems being developed today. How do you? Yeah, do you? I mean, just as a last question, who do you think this course is for?
Well, no, I think you've just outlined it exactly. In the part of the reason that the concept of autopoiesis, I think, is such an interesting one, is that it seems to generalize across living and non-living systems, at least potentially. That the first thinker to really introduce the problematic of autopoiesis, even though he didn't introduce the term, was John von Neumann, who was one of the earliest theorists, really, of computation as such. And so he was posing in the 1940s the problem of self-replicating machines. And it's out of that problem of self-replicating machines that we ended up developing the notion of cellular automata. So interestingly, we have a concept that in terms of its name comes out of systems biology, but it reproduces a problematic that 20 or even 30 years earlier was being thought on the basis of the emerging science of computation. And so this is exactly, I think, the power potentially of this notion of autopoiesis is that it might be a concept that is suitable for thinking of human societies, human languages, art, consciousness, but also large language models, human artificial intelligence hybrids, robotics, and purely mathematical objects like cellular automata as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's really good. I mean, I find it, I'm sure others do too, I find it complicated and difficult to think about, but potentially extremely useful in thinking about these trends and breaking out some of the silly ways we tend to conceptualize these things and actually offering a way of at least starting good analyses of these systems that are with us and operate, and perhaps have been anyway for some time. I think that's excellent, and really it's fantastic stuff. So really looking forward to the book, and I'm sure hopefully people will want to hear more from you, Rocco, and they should simply go to the School of Materialist Research website there and have a look at the details. I think people can sign up in lots of different ways, and I think, is it 3 or 4 part courses we're doing? I think
it's supposed to be 4. It'll be 4 sessions, probably 4 weekends.
So I think that sounds right. 4 weekends in a row. People can sign up and do much more sustained, participate in these discussions and look into these concepts and ideas in much more detail. So, I mean, thanks everyone for listening to us. So thanks for Rocco for coming on and giving us this fascinating taster. And hopefully you'll see many people in your course there.
Yeah, and thanks, Alfie, for having me.
Thanks everyone, and we're back again sometime soon with another little taster. Thanks for listening.